Welcome to Big Think Live. I'm Peter Hopkins, president and co-founder of Big Think. Today's topic is the Great Midlife Edit, how to master your middle years. Our guest today is the entrepreneur and sage Chip Conley. He is a hotelier, New York Times bestselling author, social alchemist, disruptor, student, and modern elder. Chip is the hospitality maverick who helped Airbnb's founders turn their fast-growing startup into the largest global hospitality brand. In his most recent book, Wisdom at Work, The Making of a Modern Elder, Chip shares his unexpected journey at midlife from CEO to intern, learning about tech as Airbnb's head of global hospitality and strategy, while also mentoring its CEO, Brian Chesky. Chip is also the founder of the Modern Elder Academy, which we'll be talking about a bit later, where a new roadmap for midlife is offered at a beautiful oceanfront campus in Baja California Sur, Mexico, from which Chip joins us, in fact. And he also finally serves on the board of Encore.org and the advisory board for the Stanford Center for Longevity. Chip, welcome to Big Think Live.
Peter, I just found out that you were down here in Baja just as the pandemic was kicking in. So I wish you'd stayed.
Me too. Definitely better than doing quarantine in Manhattan, at least during this pandemic anyway. If you are new to Big Think Live, today's webinar will last about 45 minutes. We'll start with a discussion with Chip, followed by audience Q&A. So whatever platform you are joining us on, be it YouTube or Facebook or Big Think Edge, please ask your questions in the comments section, and we will get to them toward the end of the hour. And you can start asking those questions right away, and they'll be fed to me for the Q&A period. So with that, let's get started. Chip, I think as a sort of precursor to the conversation, I'd love you to orient the audience as to your career trajectory, because as recently as a few years ago, you were describing yourself as an intern, but at one point in your life, you were a CEO. So can I help sort of paint a picture of sort of the path you tread?
Sure. So in my mid-20s, around 25, I started a boutique hotel company called Joie de Vivre, means joy of life in French, based in San Francisco. And I was really in the early stages of the boutique hotel movement in the United States. Ian Schrager and Bill Kimpton had started their hotel companies just before I did. And for 24 years, I was the CEO of that company I founded. We created 52 boutique hotels. We became the second largest boutique hotelier in the United States. We had only hotels in California, though. We chose to just stay on the left coast. And I then realized I didn't want to do it anymore. It was the Great Recession, and I just needed to get out. And so I sold the company. Joie de Vivre is now part of Hyatt. I did keep some of the hotel real estate, so I still own some hotels, but just the real estate side. And then I didn't know what was next. There's a famous in the movie Intern with Anne Hathaway. Did you see that, Peter?
I did not. No. This is with the Robert De Niro?
So it's a Robert De Niro and Anne Hathaway, and basically Robert De Niro, 70-year-old intern for the young 34-year-old CEO of a tech company. He joins and he says, musicians don't retire. They quit when there's no more music left inside of them. So I knew I had music still inside of me in my early 50s. I just didn't know who to share it with. And that's when Brian Chesky, co-founder and CEO of Airbnb, approached me. He said, I want you to be my mentor. I'd like to have you be my mentor. I want you to be the head of global hospitality and strategy and help us democratize hospitality. And the company was a small tech startup, and I joined. But within the first week, I realized I was as much an intern as I was a mentor because I'd never worked in a tech company before. And so ultimately, we decided I was a mentor and an intern at the same time. And so Brian and I basically mutually mentored each other. I taught him a little bit of EQ and leadership and strategy, and he taught me a lot of DQ, digital intelligence. And so I spent 4 years there full time. had a huge involvement in steering the rocket ship with them. And then for over 3 years now, almost 3.5 years, I've been a strategic advisor to Brian and the founders. So that led me to coming to Baja, and we'll talk about that later, about the Modern Elder Academy, also known as MEA.
Mm. How would you, when I first heard that you were making this leap, because you were a successful entrepreneur and made a mark. I loved your hotels, and was a patron. So when I heard about it, what dawned on me was that you were going to be the Sheryl Sandberg of Airbnb. But that's not the way you seem to want to characterize it.
Yeah.
Why not? Why not embrace that sort of you're the adult in the room motif?
Well, listen, they're all adults. Let's start with that. Yes, they're millennials, but they're all adults, and they're brilliant. There's a lot of brilliance there. So what I learned quickly was it was like wisdom and genius. Brian hired me for my knowledge, and about 3 weeks into it, he said, "You're in charge of strategy for the company now too." I said, "Brian, I've never been in a tech company. You want me to be in charge of strategy for a tech company?" He says, "Yeah, I like the fact that we hired you for your knowledge, but what we really got from you was your wisdom. And you have a pattern recognition of being able to see things before the rest of us can." And so what I had to do, Peter, was I really had to right-size my ego. And I'm not saying that Sheryl didn't have to right-size her ego, but she didn't come in with the same circumstances I did. I was CEO of my own company for 24 years. I really didn't answer to anyone. And now all of a sudden I am mentoring someone 21 years younger than me who's also my boss. 40% of the United States has a boss younger than them today. If you're 55 years old, 70% of us at 55 have a boss younger than them. So I had to get used to the idea that I was going to be part of my job was to no longer be the sage on the stage, but to be the guide on the side. And that really meant that my role was to help be in the background, supporting Brian and his co-founders to be as successful and effective as they can be. I'll never forget the first time I did my first performance review with Brian. And Brian basically, so we sat down, and it was a very good performance review. The number one negative thing he said is you're reluctant. And there was a reason I was reluctant, because I didn't want to work 70 hours a week. It was supposed to be a 15-hour-a-week thing. But one of the things that he gave me the review, and it was clear he didn't have a lot of experience giving reviews, but he was really smart, really, he was a fast learner. So at the end of the review, he says to me, "So Chip, what do you think of what I said?" And I said, "Well, Brian, do you want me to answer as your mentor who's helping you be a great leader, or as your direct report who you just told me on?" So my relationship with
you, please.
It was a little schizophrenic at times, but I didn't want to be Sheryl Sandberg. Sheryl Sandberg became COO of Facebook. I didn't want to be COO. Truly, I wanted a 15-hour-a-week job. It turned out to be 70 hours a week, and I oversaw about 7 different parts of the business. But I did that as part of a collaborative team, and that was really it. And I'm not saying that to be humble. I'm just saying that because that's really how we tried to operate. I would say one of the effects I had there was to create a really strong collaborative team. And so I was one of those team members of about 8 or 10 or 12. Yes, I was the only one who was mentoring Brian, and I was in charge of strategy for the company, and the only person who has a hospitality and travel background. So I had an outsized role of the 10 of us. But the truth was also I was learning as much as I was teaching.
Well, on that point, I was always intrigued looking from the outside at that situation. It seemed, like a very interesting move at the time when it was announced, and it made a lot of sense. And sort of intuitively, somebody with your experience who really knew what it takes at the margins to take care of the customer and create a hospitality experience that is memorable and brings you back, particularly in the context of not having control of the product in the way that you do as a hotelier. Tell us, give us a little insight into sort of what on a sort of substantive level, what were you bringing? What did you help inform and then what did they teach you that helped you sort of rethink hospitality, perhaps, or see it in a new light?
I remember in the first week, Brian, I was talking to Joe Bot. Joe Bot was the head of product. And so he told me he was the head of product. And I was like, well, wait, I'm the head of product. I'm in charge of all the hosts around the world and all the homes. And he said, Chip, that's not the product. The product's our software application. And so this was early 2013, and I'd lived in Silicon Valley my whole life, but I was not a tech person. So I didn't really understand lingo, and I didn't understand digital marketing strategy. But what I did understand was a bunch of other things. And I think probably the predominant learning I brought to the table was psychology. And one of the things I really taught the company was we need to help create the incentives for hosts to do a great job. And it can't just be a mercenary thing. We have to address both their extrinsic and their intrinsic motivations. So one of the books, I've written 5 books, and my 3rd book was called Peak, How Great Companies Get Their Mojo from Maslow. So I've been always fascinated by positive psychology. So what we did is we set up the systems in place because the challenge we had here was the people providing the service were not people who are our employees, nor did they ever have any hospitality training, nor could we actually force them to have hospitality training because that would make them employees, and we didn't want to make them employees. Right. And a lot of them were doing it part-time, and they're all over the world, in 192 countries. So what we did is we created a set of both extrinsic and intrinsic motivation factors for our host community. One of the things, an example of that was amplifying our best hosts and calling them super hosts, and having these super hosts have a set of standards that they were held accountable to, which were the standards that guests counted and appreciated. And then the superhost, we had a way for them to communicate with each other. We created forums for them to learn from each other. So the hosts were teaching each other. We vastly improved the peer-to-peer platform we had. Because one of the things that's interesting about Airbnb is 70 to 75% of hosts and guests review each other. But for the Marriott and Hiltons of the world, only about 5% of guests actually provide any online survey results. Most people just blow it off. So we were doing this, in essence, a constant iteration of improvement of quality. When I joined Airbnb, our net promoter score, NPS score, were a good bit below the hotel industry. But when I left from my full-time role and moved into a strategic advisor role, our NPS score, our guest satisfaction score, was 50% higher than the hotel industry.
Really?
Which shows that using psychology along with good algorithms, so in essence, algorithms and people wisdom, the psychology of understanding motivations, but built into a product platform with a certain amount of gamification built into it, can actually create better results.
This sounds so different than, rarely do I hear positive psychology cited as a motivating framework for any sort of digital technology.
It was that book Peak that I wrote that the 3 founders had read, and it said, we want to become a peak company. We like what we've read.
Have we lost Chip? Let's
19,
give him a moment.
Oops, did we lose? Okay.
I think we got you back.
I'm sorry about that. I'm very proud of what Brian has done in the past few months during a tumultuous period for the travel industry. And I think that part of the reason he did some really positive things for the people he had to lay off was because he created core values in a culture that was based upon psychology. And many of the things that we laid in place together, in the most dire of times, he was able to use.
Well, let's get into that a little bit, because obviously Airbnb, now having become the largest hospitality brand in the world, is also emblematic of the crisis that has befallen, that it is the sort of become synonymous with a mighty tech giant that's been hobbled a little bit. What is that Has that experience sort of summoned in your uh, counseling to Brian and the leadership team? And how does it sort of factor into the larger principles of wisdom at work? Is this consistent with those you're thinking there, or is this in some ways an outlier that says maybe some things are beyond wisdom?
I think, so wisdom, so let's define wisdom from it. Wisdom is often about pattern recognition, and it is, whereas knowledge is sort of an addition equation, you add your knowledge. Wisdom is almost a distillation, it's a division equation. It takes what is all that knowledge and it distills it down to what's truly important. So in some ways, my role in the company I believe that the first half of our life is about accumulating and the second half. And so part of my role when I joined Airbnb in early 2013 was to take 30 different strategic initiatives the company had and distill it down to 4 and say, these are the 4 we're going to bet on in the next 3 years. And we did. And as it turns out, next 2 years, and then we got some new ones. Now, one of the things I had to sort of counsel Brian on, and he was doing it on his own without me, is to say, we're in way too many different directions right now. We need to get back to what's essential. And what's essential is that we're in the business of helping people belong anywhere. One of the exercises we did at Joie de Vivre, my boutique hotel company, but then at Airbnb, was a repeating question that came from Peter Drucker. So Peter Drucker said the most important question an organizational leader can ask is, what business are you in? And so we did an exercise the first month after I joined Airbnb, where we had 12 of us in dyads ask the following question: what business are you in? So I would ask Brian, and Brian would answer it. He might say the home sharing business. And then I would ask again, what business are we in? And this time can't answer the same way twice. So you do that 5 times and you ultimately get to the distillation or the wisdom of what's your differentiator, what's the essence of your business that makes you different. And for us, we learned that we were in the belong anywhere business. So I think right now we're going back to those roots. What does it mean to belong anywhere? How do we actually create the opportunity for people to experience belong anywhere in their own backyard? Because what's for sure, and it's proven, 60% of Airbnb's business today is domestically in their own country, whereas normally it was 45%, and it's often in people's backyard. So it's be a global company, but focus on local, because people are focusing on staying near to home.
Got it. In terms of what did in hindsight, as you look back on the Airbnb experience, how would you distill it from your perspective? What did you take away, and how does that fit into this sort of larger sort of second half editing that you talk about?
Well, I take away a few things in the context of companies. I took away the fact that ageism does exist. I didn't experience it necessarily, but I started to see it in the tech world, not at Airbnb so much, but in other companies in the area. I think that the future of learning and development, while very much benefited by something like Big Think, so that people can actually do their own learning, I actually think a lot of it's going to be mutual mentorship. How do we mentor each other? How do we create mentorship matches such that if I know a lot about how to run a meeting, but I don't know much about what's in my iPhone, the company can match me with somebody with whom I can share what I know, and he or she can share what they know. So that was a great learning. I think mutual mentorship is a huge undervalued learning and development tool for the future, especially because it's very inexpensive, as in free. So the other thing, though, that really relates to this idea that what does it mean to be in a world where we're going to tend to live longer than our parents, on average maybe 10 years longer than our parents. Power in a digital society is moving 10 years younger, as evidenced by the tech giants and the average age of the CEOs there. And the world's changing faster. So if we're going to live 10 years longer, power's moving 10 years younger, we now have an irrelevancy gap that's 20 years long in the middle of people's lives. And then having a world that's changing faster just makes people even more bewildered. So I decided to write this book, Wisdom at Work, The Making of a Modern Elder. While I was writing that book down here in Baja, where I have a home on the beach, I had this epiphany. Like, why is it that there's no such thing as a midlife wisdom school, a place where people go to actually repurpose and reset themselves for the next era of their life? Because people are more and more are working longer. And so I decided to create a beta program of the Modern Elder Academy, also known as MEA, the first half of 2018, and it was a smashing success. And so we decided to open to the public in November of 2018, and have now had 750 people from 24 countries go through the program, and have had like net promoter scores of 94, like off the charts scores. Wow. And really, really, really transformative experience for all kinds of people. I thought it was just going to be people 45 to 65, but we've had people as young as 30 and as old as 88. The average age is 54. And the predominant reason people come is because they want to navigate their midlife transitions and shift their mindset about aging. Because if you're 54 years old and a woman in the United States, and you're going to live till age 90, which is not unheard of. In fact, there's probably, if you're 54 now, the chances you'll live till 90 are probably about 40%. Your likely age you're going to live till is about 87. So you're large chance you're going to live till 90, and you're 54. Guess what, Jane, who's 54? You are only halfway through your adult life if you start counting at age 18. Do the math. That's how it works. So 54 is midlife for adulthood. And it may be mid-career because you might work till you're 75 or 80. We do not have schools and tools to help people in midlife reimagine how they're going to repurpose themselves in new ways. And so that's what we do, and it's really necessary. And of course, in the pandemic, we're closed, but we reopened in October, and we're actually developing a digital program as well.
You know, it's funny, as I was preparing for the interview and getting acquainted with the book, you know, this idea that, you know, we've arrived at a stage where, you know, we just don't have the cultural equipment, so to speak, to psychologically update ourselves to the circumstances we're in, and to take the skills we do have and repackage them for, you know, not only the moment, but for the future. And what sort of came into my mind is sort of the image of people who are not doing this well, you know, who are finding themselves frustrated or deadlocked in life. Perhaps you can sort of describe the audience, sort of what are the symptoms? What does this look like and feel like? And how can they know if maybe this is, you know, at the root of some of the, you know, issues and uncertainties that they're feeling?
Take a look at the video that led to OK Boomer. You saw sort of an older white guy, sort of stodgy, basically looking like his purpose in life was to tell younger people how the world works. That doesn't work in today's five generation workplace. So generally people who are stuck in midlife and, you know, in their 40s, 50s, or 60s, let's focus, that's sort of the core of midlife, is that define them are you seeing me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, it sounded like it was messing up a little bit. There needs to be, Carol Dweck, the Stanford psychologist, has popularized the concept of mindset. And you can have a fixed or a growth mindset in various parts of your life. A fixed mindset generally means your role is to prove yourself. And the idea of winning is, success is defined by winning. So you tend to focus on the things you do well. And if you have a fixed mindset in adulthood, it means that over time, the sandbox that you play in actually shrinks. Because if you only like to play games that you win, because that defines success for you, and you're trying to prove yourself because you think you have a finite amount of skill, you don't actually try new things. The opposite of that is a growth mindset. And if you have a growth mindset, you're not actually focused on proving yourself. You're focused on improving yourself. And success is defined not by winning, but by learning. And so one of the qualities that we really try to help people to understand is that a modern elder is not just wise, they're curious. And so to be curious and wise and to know what's the perfect alchemy of when you want to offer one versus the other is part of what it means to be a modern elder. And so what we really play up is the idea of having an openness to new experiences. Now, that is something that when we tend to think of older people, we often think of people losing that capability. And it is the number one dysfunction for people 55 years and older in terms of a personality trait. The fact that they lose an openness to new experiences. But when you look at the people who are most flourishing, 55 and older, they are the counter of that. They tend to actually be at the standard deviation extreme of their openness to try new things. So down here at MEA, it means that we help people to try yoga for the first time, or to meditate, or maybe to actually surf because we go surfing, or to try their hand at poetry, or improv, or how to actually stack stones such that it feels like you're mentoring the stone, because the process of stacking stone is very much like having the presence of mentoring someone younger than you. So it is a very experiential program built on the premise, or baking bread. Oh my God, I thought when my team said, we're going to have each cohort learn how to bake bread in small groups, like, that's a terrible idea. I don't want to bake bread. It's like, okay, Chip, where's your growth mindset on baking? So
always but one.
Yeah. So we realized, I think, along the way that that part of what we have to help people to do is to let go of what's no longer serving them. And that brings me to the Great Midlife Edit. I'm going to say a couple things about that and then give it back to you, Peter. One of the biggest challenges people have in midlife is they've been accumulating. They've been accumulating knowledge, stuff, friendships, boyfriends, girlfriends, husbands, wives, children, roles in work, responsibilities outside of work. So you get to age 45 to 50 and you hit this U curve of happiness, which has been proven by social scientists, when people don't have a crisis exactly, but what they have is a bottoming out, and what Brené Brown would call an unraveling. And what happens at that point is that people are really well suited to ask the question, what no longer serves me and how can I get rid of it? Mm-hmm. But we have no social context or any kind of programming that helps people to actually go through that. So that's actually what we do in our first 24 hours is we help people with their Great Midlife Edit, which is the first step of 4 steps that we take them through: evolve, learn, collaborate, counsel. But if you actually aren't willing to evolve and aren't willing to edit some things out of your life, it's really hard to give attention to something new. And so, if I had to give advice to someone who wasn't coming to MEA about this, is it would be to make a list of, what are the things in your life that serve you that are actually you want to have more of, maybe even learn more about, and what are the things that just you need to start letting go of, and how do you edit some of those out of your life? And these sometimes are very difficult questions. They're not meant for a 10-minute, moment when you're in in line somewhere. Although we aren't in lines anymore, are we, Peter? It's meant for a deeper dive, but some people can read more about it in my book. So.
I'm curious how you came upon positive psychology and why it, as a sort of bedrock concept for, it sort of informs a lot of what I'm hearing. How did you arrive on that? And what was the process like of sort of the introspective process of developing this whole program, presumably from your own experiences as well as your research?
The program, I was fortunate. Let me say, first of all, the program has been crafted by a handful of professors from Berkeley and Stanford and UCLA and elsewhere. So it's been a group effort for sure. But positive psychology has been a part of it. a moderate part of it. For me, I only took one psychology class in college. I went to Stanford, and that one class I took, I remember Maslow, and I remember Maslow being sort of the guy who focused on best practices in human behavior as opposed to worst. And I thought that made sense. Like, why don't we study the people who are flourishing and learn from them as opposed to study the neurotics and the psychotics and the homicidal maniacs? And when
People
I had
prefer homicidal maniacs. They're among our more popular topics. Sociopaths are.
yeah, sociopaths, and there's sociopaths who are leaders, and I won't get into that. But like, what I will say is that the process when I went through the dot-com bust 9/11 downturn, I had to come face to face with my own existential crisis as the CEO of a company that at that point had been running for about 15 years. And what I came away with, I went to the local Borders bookstore, which no longer exists. And I was in the business section of the bookstore for about 10 minutes. And I realized how depressed I was. And I realized my problems were bigger than the business. So I went to the self-help section of the bookstore. And that's where we got reacquainted with Abraham Maslow's books. And Abe Maslow was for those who don't know him, was a mid-century, 20th century psychologist who focused on his hierarchy of needs and people having some basic needs. And then once those needs are partially met, you get up to the top of the pyramid and you have self-actualization. And what a lot of people don't know about later in life is he talked about self-transcendence. So I took that Maslowian concept of the hierarchy of needs and I applied it to our company. And we tripled in size in a very difficult time. And that's what led me to writing the book Peak. And that's what led, Tony Hsieh to approaching me, and he said Zappos wants to do this, and so he wrote the foreword to the book, a later edition of the book, and that's when the founders of AirBnB joined me or asked me to join them. So I found that psychology, I think one of the most neglected facts in business is that we're all human. Amongst our spreadsheets and org charts and all of that, at the end of the day, so much of it comes down to the psychology of humans. And it's surprising how little psychology is used on a conscious level at the C level of most companies. So I like to think of myself. Someone once in an article said Chip is the crossing guard at the tragic intersection of psychology and business, and I'll take that. I am the guard with my orange vest and my stop, slow down. But it served me well, and my 5 books have really woven psychology and business together, and entrepreneurship, and so I'm a big advocate for us hiring more people with this into the workplace, as long as those psychologists have a practical perspective on psychology.
Now, before we shift to audience questions, I want to hit a couple of more themes from the book, because I think you have a lot of interesting concepts that almost are delightful nuggets unto themselves. You make a distinction between lifelong learning and long life learning. Elaborate on that a little bit for us.
It's a very new idea. I'm working on a white paper, academic paper with a Canadian professor on it right now called The Emergence of Long Life Learning, How Midlife Evolved from a Crisis to a Calling. The premise is this: lifelong learning is great. I mean, Big Think is a lifelong learning platform. And I think you look at 60 years of history, lifelong learning came about because there was a premise that you don't stop learning when you leave college or graduate school, and you're going to learn it for a lifetime. And learning and curiosity is an elixir for life. What lifelong learning is missing at times is that if I'm doing a job transition at age 30, it's going to be different than at age 55. And similarly, my sense of what my role is in a company is going to be different at those ages. And so long life learning suggests that there's a lens in which some of the learning needs to happen within, which is the lens of, if you're in midlife, you're probably starting to ask questions about, not just retirement, but your mortality. And you start asking questions about, contentment as opposed to happiness. People, when they're younger in life, are focused on happiness. Later in life, you're focused on contentment. You're focused on things like middlescence. Middlescence is the bookend of adolescence. Adolescence happens, in your teen years when you go through physical, emotional, and hormonal changes. Middlescence is when menopause happens for women, andropause happens for men, and you're going through physical, emotional, and hormonal changes. I didn't know about this stuff. Nobody had taught me what it means to be a mentor and an intern at the same time. Nobody had taught me that liminality, which means being in transition, is fine in adulthood. And so part of what we help people to see is that there is, if you're going to live a life that's a lot longer than our parents or than you even imagined, and you're at midlife, mid-adult life at age 54, with 36 years ahead of you, as that woman I mentioned earlier, you better learn how to live a life that's as deep as it is long. And lifelong learning is generally acquisition of knowledge. Long life learning is the distillation of wisdom. And I can go into much more detail about that. And anybody who wants to read about it can read about my book or come down to MEA. But it's really interesting. And I think the idea of midlife wisdom schools are going to pop up, especially given that we're like the higher education world, colleges and universities were in a lot of trouble before the pandemic. Clay Christensen, disruptive innovation theorist, the late Clay Christensen, said 2 years ago, by the year 2030, half of the colleges and universities in the United States will be gone. Well, wouldn't it be interesting if we repackaged and rethought these beautiful campuses and turned them into places where people in midlife came back, did a sabbatical, did a gap year to actually repackage and repurpose themselves? Why is learning exclusively something that the young do? And why isn't wisdom something we cultivate and harvest over a lifetime?
That sounds like an incredible idea. I detect the seeds of a possible venture there, Chip.
We are talking to a bunch of universities, and they're in a state of trauma, to be honest with you, because they were having this problem pre-pandemic, and now post-pandemic, if you're a private university that has really charged a lot of money for something that people now feel like they're doing online, how do you charge that premium? Yeah. And how do you start finding new customers?
It's like a sort of reimagined MBA for any time in life.
We call it the MEA. So yes.
Huh.
Modern Elder Academy. Yeah.
Talk to me about the idea of a midlife calling.
So the thing that's interesting is that there's Carl Jung, the psychologist, studied this, but also James Hillman and a few other people. The first half of your life is the primary operating system is your ego. And in fact, the ego is almost like the bookends of the ego are the adolescence and middlescence. It's not to say that ego didn't exist pre-adolescence, it does, but it really comes into full ferociousness around adolescence. And then around middlescence and your maybe late 40s, early 50s, you start to shift out of that. But most people don't have any language for this. And you shift into this primary operating system being your soul. And you go a little deeper. And what happens is you start, especially if you've had kids and now you're an empty nester, you start having a little bit more time to reflect. And what happens is this weird thing happens where you start to actually listen to things you didn't have time for. Because frankly, your 30s and your 40s are the rush hour of life. It's the time when you have just the pileup of way too many things happening at once. And so it is in that period of time, starting often in your early 50s when the U-curve of happiness starts to go up, that people start to get in touch with the things that matter to them and the things they've always wanted to do but haven't done yet. And whether that is going back and from being a lawyer to going to being a school teacher, or starting a nonprofit, or it means going out and traveling around the world for a year and becoming a digital nomad, which we think of just the digital nomads being a millennial thing. But I have a bunch of boomer friends who are digital nomads right now and going around the world. They're stuck in certain places right now, but they're going to reopen when they're starting to travel again. So the calling is the idea that there's a call. To have a calling, there's someone calling you. I'm not suggesting it has to be a religious calling, although that's sort of the history of the word. It actually can come from something that's just inside your intuition that says, this is what I'm supposed to be doing now. Midlife is the period of time when we basically throw off all of the uniforms that have been thrust upon us by other people, and we end up back in our bathing suit or our birthday suit at a time in our life when we say, okay, I'm going to focus on what matters to me.
I'm curious, how much do you think we are beholden to our age and the cycle of life that we're in, and how much agency do we have to pursue calling earlier in life if that is sort of where we're drawn?
Listen, I've had many callings early in life, so it doesn't mean you can't have a calling early in life. You absolutely can. It does mean that instead of feeling stuck in midlife or narrowing the opportunities, having a smaller sandbox, we start opening up to possibilities that people aren't used to doing in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. So I absolutely agree with you that agency is a fundamental part of this that makes it work. The problem is, to go back to Carl Jung again, is often it is our shadows or our unconsciousness that actually leads it to our darkness. It's the things that we aren't asking about or the things that we're not focusing on that are the blind spots. And so, yes, the person who actually doesn't realize that they are ageist themselves and they are pouring Botox in their face to try to look younger because they're worried about their job, that person is absolutely creating havoc for the rest of their life, because you can only do that for so long without looking stupid.
Do you describe that person as ageist? Or I'm
going to move locations just for a second.
Is ageism? I mean, are you suggesting that you see somebody who's trying to defy growing older as ageist themselves, as if they are somehow part of the problem?
Well, when someone believes the following myth, that their best years are behind them, and that may be true. Just when you got comfortable in your own skin, it started to sag. So, I mean, it may be true that certain parts of our life get worse with time. Physical health does. What a lot of people don't know is a lot of people think, oh, the brain, it just gets worse with time. Well, yeah, recall, memory is not as good. You're not as quick. But what a lot of people don't know about is crystallized intelligence and the fact that your brain actually gets better with time up till your early to mid 60s in terms of being able to think holistically, synthetically, and connect the dots. This is part of the reason why Brian liked me as the head of strategy in the company, because he could see that my mind thought holistically. Your heart and your soul get better with age. So what I see as ageist is when somebody is assuming that life is purely all about having a midlife crisis, and on the other side of that, you have disease and decrepitude, and a serious decline to death. When in fact, for those who don't know, the U curve of happiness shows that people get happier in their 50s than 40s, happier in their 60s than 50s, happier in their 70s than 60s, women happier in their 80s than 70s. So it is a U curve that goes down from your early 20s to 45 to 50 and then goes back up. And that's life satisfaction. So but I'm not going to point someone out and say, you're an ageist asshole. And instead, I'm going to sort of look at this and say, hey, how could we shift your mindset on that?
Mm.
And that's really the point here, is we live in an era where we have a longevity revolution, and yet we don't have a revolution in terms of our mindset around the thinking of age.
Mm.
So
Yeah,
how
well,
could we make aging aspirational again?
I mean, that's the part of your work that is so resonant with me, is just, the constant reminder that the institutions and the culture are not, in step with the lifestyle and the biotechnology that's keeping us alive so long, and that we just have to rewrite some of these scripts, or face real detriment. And I think a lot of us feel it, particularly in the pandemic, I think, which is such a moment of great pause and reflection for everybody. I think now, more than any time is, it is the right time to embrace some of these, more growth oriented ways of being, and that the idea that people, older people can themselves perpetuate this, by thinking that it's not possible and actually be, contributing to the problem, I think is a really important insight, because I only think of ageism as going in one direction, from young to the old,
Mm-hmm.
not being sort of self-inflicted.
Ageism can, yeah, no, actually, it's lots of studies have shown that sometimes the most ageist people are the oldest. But let's also recognize that ageism can happen in the opposite direction too. If you're in an old line company, financial services firm, manufacturing company, healthcare, often the ageism is against young people. I happen to be in a tech company, so the ageism was potentially in the opposite direction, but ageism can happen in both directions.
Hmm. Well, with that, we're going to segue to audience questions. The first of which is, Chip, how old are you? How do you feel about your age? You don't have to answer how old, but I will be curious. How do you conceptualize?
I am 59 and a half. So I'm turning 60 Halloween, and my 50s has been my favorite decade, hands down, no doubt about it. My favorite decade, and so. Why is that? Why has it been a great decade? It's been a great decade partly because I stopped caring so much what other people thought about me. And that was a huge way. That was, in terms of that Great Midlife edit, what no longer serves me. I was like, well, one of the things that didn't serve me anymore was caring so much about what other people thought of me. It didn't mean I couldn't be a caring and nice person. It just meant, that's their thing, not my thing.
Another question from the audience. How do you help midlife people move out of the desire of being forever young? I think this sort of goes back to the ageism, this sort of fetishization of youthfulness. How do people break out of that?
I think the most important piece of that is, who are you surrounding yourself with? And it doesn't mean you shouldn't surround yourself with young people. I spend a ton of time with young people. At AirBnB, I was twice the average age of people in the company, and I had so many friends there. But what it means is, who are the people you surround yourself with that are similar age to you, and what's their point of view around aging? If you're surrounded by people who are freaked out about it, or having, lots of cosmetic surgery, or are lying about their age on Match.com, or whatever they're doing, or they're narrowing their prospects of how they're living their life because they're living a fixed mindset, then you're hanging out with the wrong people. And this is, so I would say, looking at, and the last thing I would just say, beyond just looking at books like my book or others, we have 400 books in our MEA library here that are all based upon how do you help people understand the unexpected pleasures of aging and what are some of the positives that come from it. So there's lots of books out there on the subject. But I would just say, stop seeing your body, your face, and your physical condition as the exclusive definition of how ripe you are in your life. Because if you do that, you will be a rotten banana pretty quickly. But if you see your heart and your soul and your intuition and your EQ, emotional intelligence, grows with age, and your brain in terms of that connecting the dots, and your ability to get out of your own way and your own ego, Those are all things that get better with time.
Moving on to our next question, which is this viewer wants some book recommendations. Speaking of your library, what are a few books, Chip, or people that shaped your perspective on being a modern elder? So what's your essential reading list?
So I'll just throw out a few. The 100-Year Life by Andrew Scott and Linda Grattan from London School of Business. Great book about a whole different perspective. They've been able to show that the average child being born today is going to live to 100. How does that change our society? So it's a great book, but it's particularly great for those of us in midlife, realizing somehow that our game of life that we're playing. Remember the game of life you used to play as a kid? It had one linear direction in it. Well, that doesn't make any sense anymore. So it's a great book. Mark Friedman has written a bunch of books on this subject. The most recent one is called How to Live Forever. It is not a book about how to become a robot. It is truly about intergenerational collaboration and how to provide generativity and give back. That's a great book. There's a book that's coming out next month that I think will be very successful. I got the pre-reader copy it's going to be called Transitions. I don't remember it. So I'm going to give you a different one instead. I'm going to say William Bridges' book called Transitions is one of the best books ever written about how to go through transitions. And he has a book that's called The Way of Transition that's also quite good. Let's come up with some women. I love anything that Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson's daughter has written. And now I'm showing you the memory thing with getting older.
I was actually going to give you credit for even trying.
Yeah, I think it's Catherine Bateson. And she wrote a book called Composing a Life. And it's really very beautiful about how do you curate and compose a life. And how do you do that, especially in midlife and later. She has a great metaphor in that book about the midlife atrium. She says most of us have a tendency to think if we've got extra years, it means we have extra years at the end of our life. But the truth is that actually how many years of disease or decrepitude we have hasn't changed much. So it means that we have longer midlife. And so she calls this, you have to create your own midlife atrium. Because the midlife atrium is when in midlife you actually have more years during the period of time when you have your physical health is usually pretty good, your mental health is good, you still can make a big difference in your. So how do you help people architect and create the blueprint for their midlife atrium? That is part of what we do here at the Modern Elder Academy as well, is we create that midlife atrium.
That's interesting. Yet again, another example of sort of the mismapping and mischaracterization, where we have this, basically inflating idea of what old age is and, everything that's associated with it and what's not possible versus, a more agentic, growth-driven, reconsidering. I love that. Moving on, because we just have a couple minutes left, and I want to make sure we get to as many of these as we can. One viewer wants you to, if you could, summarize the skills that you think people need to be focused on in midlife and beyond. Are there specific skills that they need to train to be better in that and to harness, the experiences and other wisdom?
I would highly recommend people read Arthur Brooks' article from The Atlantic last June 2019, called "Your Professional Decline is Coming Much Sooner Than You Expect." And while it's a pretty depressing article for the first 2/3 of it, because it talks about how our decline in a digital society is happening faster, the last 1/3 of the article is really interesting. It says the following, that we get better with age at being less selfish, more synthetic in our thinking, better teachers, better mentors, better coaches, better professors, better at being able to lead teams. We're better collaborators. And so, one of the things that's interesting is Google proved with their Project Aristotle that the number one variable for successful teams at Google was psychological safety. And one of the things that didn't get nearly as much attention was that one of the elements of psychological safety is to have age diversity on teams. And generally speaking, when you have older people on teams, if it's a very younger company, the older people on teams are really good at helping to foster collaboration. So what that means is there's a lot of ways you can actually use, instead of becoming a software developer in your 50s, you can become a soft skills developer in your 50s because you spend a lifetime developing those soft skills. And now's the time to leverage them because frankly, I mean, one of the things I've said before is that we see, these young digital brilliant people creating companies that make them billionaires in their 20s or their 30s. But we expect these young digital leaders to somehow miraculously embody the emotional intelligence and leadership skills that those of us who are older have had decades to learn. So why don't we partner with them? So that's the opportunity.
As an employer, former CEO, and obviously, top executive at Airbnb, how would you advise somebody who's in their middle to later life to present that set of skills? How do you go in and say, well, I don't know, I can't code at all, but I can certainly help your, antisocial developers better, deliver product. How do you present that without coming across as presumptuous, I guess is my question.
Let me say, first of all, some software out there, the recruitment software is ageist in its algorithm. So that is one challenge people have. But if you can get to the place through your core contacts network as well as your soft contacts and network, such that you can get an interview, here's what you need to do: show up with curiosity and passionate engagement. Because one of the best executive recruiters in the world told me this. She says, the best thing I can advise people who are, say, 45 or 50 years old and older is show up curious and passionately engaged. Because if you do that, what people will notice is not your wrinkles. They'll notice your energy. And when they see your energy and sort of your sense of joie de vivre, go back to your joy of life, your spirit, your zest, your sense of being someone who is in a constant state of evolution, then what you end up with is people not asking your age, not caring about it, because what they actually get is your energy. Now that sounds sort of woo-woo. I don't mean energy like, okay, they see that you're like some new age thinker. No, they see that you are energetic and passionate and curious. And generally speaking, in many cases, those are the qualities that a lot of people don't think. And open-minded, which could be curious. Those are qualities that sometimes people don't think an older person has.
Now we just have time for one or two more. There's one that I have to ask. It's a bit of a flyer, but I am curious. This person wants to know, what are your thoughts on there being an upper age limit on the presidency? Is it in light of our age election we're about to go through? Should there be a cap? Is there a point where we're past our sell-by date?
So basically, we have 35 to whatever right now. There's no upper limit. I think it's the American people who decide that. I will say that Peter Drucker wrote two-thirds of the 40 books he wrote was after the age of 65. He lived till age 95. Every 2 years, he would study a subject and become one of the world's leading experts on it. And it had nothing to do with being a management theorist. So I don't think there should be an upper limit because I think that people have various skill sets and their ability to be effective at whatever age. I do think that we need to be careful of people who are either fixed in their thinking and older, because that doesn't do anybody any good, or potentially narcissistic and they're older, because if you haven't actually outgrown your narcissism by your 70s, you probably never will.
Well said.
Anything more than that?
Well, with that, Chip, I'm going to thank you. It was such a pleasure having you on Big Think Live.
Thank you. Peter, I appreciate what you guys do, and it's my second time. I'm coming back almost 10 years later, so I appreciate coming back.
So good to have you back. I have followed you for many years, and it was always a delight to see what you're up to, because you are a true big thinker and an inspiration. So thank you.
Thanks so much.
I want to thank the audience for joining us today. I want to also let you know that our next Big Think Live will be this coming Thursday at 1 p.m. with authors and spouses Michael Chabon and Ayelet Waldman.
I love them. I love them. I had dinner with them a few years ago. Just the three of them.
We're just going to mine your Rolodex, Chip. I feel like if we did that, it would save us so much time and effort.
All right.
But they will be discussing their latest book, Fight of the Century. Writers reflect on 100 years of landmark ACLU cases, and Maria Konnikova will be moderating, and she has a new book coming out as well called The Biggest Bluff. So anyway, everyone, please join us if you can, and stay safe, and thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, thank you, Chip. It was a pleasure.
Yeah.